like to begin by telling you a little bit about what the agenda will be, and then we'll ask Father Twiddell to deliver the invocation. We'll have the invocation by Monsignor Twiddell and a welcome by President Chillo. I will provide the introductions to the three speakers, followed by Professor Deneen with the keynote address. Dr. Schindler and Dr. Spence will give commentaries, followed by a rejoinder that Dr. Deneen will have a chance to give, and then a question and answer. Monsignor Twiddell, would you provide an invocation?
Let us pray. O God, creator of all, you give us life and plant within us a longing to know you. You reveal your glory in all the beauty of the universe. You draw us toward your goodness, and you arouse a hunger to give fitting response to the wonder in our hearts, to deepen our knowledge of you, our source and origin, to find words to express our awe at all we receive from you. As we strive to discover how best we might show our reverence, we acknowledge our frailty and failures to respect one another's efforts as we ought. Grant that we may learn ever more fully to respect one another's right to live our faith in freedom, peace, and tranquility, so that our voices may join together in one great harmony as we proclaim, to you be all honor and glory forever. Amen.
I think I've been told on more than one occasion I don't need a mic. I think my voice booms loud enough, but I want to thank Ray and certainly welcome all of you here tonight for the William T. Robinson III Institute for Religious Liberty. We have the bells ringing now. We compete on that every top of the hour as well. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all, to our community, and certainly to Dr. Patrick Deneen, our esteemed professor from the University of Notre Dame, who is visiting with us this evening, along with Dr. Jeanne Schindler, research fellow from the John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University, and our own Dr. John Spence, professor of political science. I'd also like to take a moment and welcome those who are watching us on Facebook this evening, and certainly are delighted that you're joining us here. Thomas More University is the Catholic university in the Diocese of Covington, which serves more than 2,000 students from northern Kentucky to around the world. As we celebrate our centennial this year, it gives us reason to pause and celebrate our history and tradition, and to attest the benefits of a strong Catholic liberal arts education. The ability to think creatively, to be effective communicators, and to be ethical and servant leaders, and to have a positive impact upon others in our communities are hallmarks of a Thomas More education. And our students and alumni continue to exemplify our mission and our values. Inspired by the Catholic intellectual tradition and by our patron, St. Thomas More, we challenge students of all faiths to examine the ultimate meaning of life, their place in the world, and their responsibilities to others. And certainly the world events of today, and certainly those ahead of us, certainly are hallmarks of those responsibilities that you all will have. Since its founding as Villa Madonna College in 1921, the university has grown, and today plays a critical role in the success of northern Kentucky and the greater Cincinnati region. The new university strategic plan, Lighting the Way, lays out an ambitious roadmap that positions Thomas More University strategically as we begin our second century. As the oldest higher education institution in northern Kentucky, we take great pride in our history, the significance that Villa Madonna College, Thomas More College, and today Thomas More University has had in the development of northern Kentucky, and the many lives that our institution has touched over the past 100 years, and the role that we play in shaping the future of Catholic higher education. Looking ahead, it gives us great excitement to recognize our past and our legacy but more importantly, it gives us an opportunity to forge our destiny and our future as a premier Catholic liberal arts university. We are fortunate through the generosity of William B. Robinson and his wife Joan, who currently serves on our Board of Trustees, to have established the William T. Robinson Institute for Religious Liberty at Thomas More University. Established in 2015, the mission of the Institute is to advance the American concept of religious freedom as an inalienable right and the protection of that right for all people, which is essential to our democratic values. Since 2015, the Institute has sought to bring dynamic and distinguished scholars, including those that we have here tonight with us, to our campus to engage in conversations that are timely and relevant. The William T. Robinson Institute for Religious Liberty exemplifies the very best of a liberal arts education and the importance of differences and understanding those differences that make up our world and our communities. And these differences should unite us rather than divide us. And that pursuit of the truth is an enduring quality of the values that we hold dear. As I look out to our students who are here tonight and consider the world that they will inherit, we all need to do a better job of listening and understanding differences that maintain religious freedom as an inalienable right, and that the pursuit of truth must endure. Here at Thomas More, as our mission states, we challenge students of all faiths, and we will continue to do so. Our mission is timely, relevant, and compelling. At the forefront of the institution's work is the work and the vision of Dr. Ray Aber, who serves as our executive director, and certainly the executive committee for their work in putting this event together tonight for all of us. This evening's event, titled The Problem with Religious Liberty, brings together three distinguished scholars and individuals who embody the values and the significance of religious freedom, the strength of Thomas More University and our commitment as a Catholic liberal arts university is evident this evening, and I thank our distinguished scholars in sharing their scholarship, their work, their experience, and their passion with all of us. I hope you enjoy this evening's event and presentation and conversation. Again, thank you for all of you who are joining us here tonight in person, plus those who are here on Facebook. Welcome to Thomas More Universities.
As we begin, I'd like to provide a little bit of context as to why this particular event is more important to me than most, and probably to any. I first heard Dr. Deneen speak in 2017 at the University of Cincinnati. It had only been just the year before that I was asked to become the executive director, and in hearing what he had to say while there, I saw someone who would be a perfect fit for one of our programs. He was invited in 18, we began the process in 19, and I think we've canceled it twice, and now finally we're here. And I'm truly excited to have him with us, as well as our two commentators. Dr. Deneen is a professor of political science and holds the David A. Potenziani Memorial Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame, position he's held since 2012, and has previous teaching experience at Princeton and Georgetown universities. His expertise ranges from ancient to American political thought, liberalism, conservatism, religion and politics, literature and politics. He's the best known of his 5 books is the 2018 New York Times bestseller, now translated into 20 different languages, called Why Liberalism Failed. Dr. Jeanne Schindler is a research fellow of the John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University of America, with previous teaching experience at both Pepperdine and Villanova universities. Her intellectual interests include an integrated interdisciplinary focus combining the fields of philosophy, theology, and political science. She and her husband, Dr. D.C. Schindler, co-edited a Robert Spearman reader, and she edited the popular work called Christianity and Society. Our own Dr. John J.T. Spence, Professor of Political Science at Thomas More since 2007, had previous teaching experience in American government at Xavier University. He's a U.S. Army veteran with 20 years of experience in economic development and city planning, and has been recognized as a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners since 1984. The focus of JT's research is on political behavior and civic engagement. With that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Patrick Deneen. You want to speak from here or there, Okay, all right.
Okay, that's working? All right, great. Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here. My first time at this university. I've had a wonderful day meeting some students and faculty, a number of old friend, not old, but a friend of long-standing, Jeannie, and some new friends.
Of long-standing.
A friend of long-standing. Jeanne and I haven't seen each other. We calculated now about 20 years, but it does feel like it was not that long ago because it's very quick to remember old friendships. But particularly I want to thank Ray Hebert for the invitation and, as you heard, his persistence in making this happen. And this was not easy. It wasn't easy just because of scheduling and also obviously the virus and all of the ramifications. So the fact we're able to gather together tonight to talk about this extremely important issue is really, I think, we owe him a debt of thanks and gratitude. So this is a college that's named in honor of St. Thomas More, whom I assume you all have to know something about. To be a student here, I hope you have to know something about him. Famously a martyr in the really beginnings of what was the Protestant Reformation in England, and someone notably who did not enjoy religious liberty at that moment. Indeed, you could say that he is proof positive that religious liberty is often very rare and seldom found, especially when political powers aim and indeed are determined to govern and to govern in neglect of the claims of religion. In fact, in some respects, Thomas More reflects what I want to suggest tonight is more the norm of the human world, which is that religious liberty is exceedingly rare and hardly ever seen in history, just to a certain extent. And my question tonight is it something we can expect today in the context of modern America, the modern America liberal order that we live in? I'll proceed in three steps to discuss the question of religious liberty, or the problem of religious liberty, which I will explore largely from a political perspective. I'm a political scientist, but when I say political, I mean it in the broadest sense, in the philosophical, political in its philosophical orientation. I'll begin by discussing what has often been, what I would argue has been for much of human history and over much of the world, the norm of the relationship of the city to religion. And the norm has been the effort to construct one city, to make religion and the city one, to make it, in a sense, the same, to make the city's religion the religion of all people in the city, and to make the religion, in some ways, a support for the city. Its purpose, the purpose of the religion, is to support the city. The second step will be at least a very brief discussion that many of you will know better than I will, because I'm not a theologian, and I'm sure some of you have much more theological training than I do, which is to discuss what I see as the revolution that's introduced into the world in the person of Jesus Christ and in his ministry and in and through his church, but articulated perhaps most powerfully by St. Augustine, who argued that there are two cities. There are two cities to which we all belong, the city that we happen to live in, where we are, in some senses, citizens. But the city of God to which our true citizenship is oriented, to which our true membership ultimately that we aim and hope for. And it's famously Augustine who suggests that we are better understood in the relationship of our existing cities as peregrinator, or people who wander. The word that we use most often to translate that is pilgrims. So it's not just people who wandered over here from England in the 17th, 18th century that are pilgrims that we remember on Thanksgiving. Augustine counsels us that we're to understand all of our lives and our situation and condition as pilgrims, as our membership here is temporary and that we are wandering in this time and place. And the last thing I want to ask, and I want to suggest tonight, is having these two sort of, let's say, alternatives, as two big alternatives in human city, whether we live in one city or two cities. The question we have before ourselves tonight is in the condition of liberalism, the philosophical order and the political order that we live in. Is this one city or two cities? Can we expect religious liberty from this regime? Or are we somewhat more in the condition of Thomas More, who didn't necessarily expect religious liberty from the regime of Henry VIII? I'll be answering the question in the negative, and we might hear some argument against that, and that's why we're here tonight. I'll be answering the question, I should be saying, that liberalism seeks to create one city, ultimately. All right, let me begin then. Let's start with my first thesis. My first thesis is that there is no such thing as religious liberty in the abstract. I will grant that it exists in the abstract as a philosophical concept or even a theological concept. But in practice, in the practice of our human lives, religion is always interacting. The computer just went off. There we go. Religion is always interacting with and in the political realm. It is never going to be, in some ways, not in relationship with our political order. And so there's always going to be a complex relationship between the claims of religion and the claims of religious believers and the political orders and societies in which they live. And so the question in some ways is what is the prevailing condition in those political orders in which those who are worshipers can expect to be received, understood, and treated in those political situations. In most human civilizations, and I haven't done a comprehensive study of every human civilization, but most that I'm familiar with, for much of human history, and certainly before the advent of Christianity, which perhaps is arguably a relatively brief blip in the history of humanity, if we look at it in terms of the vast expanse of time, religion has been understood as serving the ends of the political order. Its purpose is to support the political order. And thus religion is, in some senses, constrained by and even defined by the state, the city. In antiquity, we can think of, this is the argument for that there's really one, that in much of the world and much of human history, we see the effort to create one city. The city of man and the city of God are one. In much of antiquity, I would suggest that what we now today call the theological political problem, what Augustine introduces in many ways, how you live in two cities, which is the title of a wonderful book, Living in Two Cities. The problem of living in two cities is not the problem for antiquity. In antiquity, the problem is what do you do when someone is not obedient to the gods of your city? We have the example of, and this is especially in the West, the great civilizations that we especially turn to and look to as the examples, the predecessors of our own civilization, are defined by what we largely call civil religion, a religion of the city, a religion that is sanctioned by the city, officially defined by the city, the gods that are approved by the city, the gods that exist in the pantheon of the city. This word pantheon, all the gods, this is all the gods of the city. They exist in the pantheon. The ancient Roman pantheon, and today the pantheon in French is a kind of exemplar of the idea of a civil religion, where you find the gods who are kept, who live in the city. And of course, maybe the example par excellence is Athens, whose name reflects the goddess of the city. the goddess Athena, the goddess who, if you know the ancient myth, is the goddess who's responsible for giving the great blessing of the olive tree to the city of Athens. There's a competition in which Poseidon, I forget who else, Poseidon, Athena, and maybe Aphrodite sort of compete who has the best things to give to the city of Athens, who will be named, who will receive the naming rights of the city, this great city. And Athena wins because she gives them, she creates the olive tree, which is a great blessing for many reasons for the Athenians. The city is named for her, and she is one of the official approved goddesses. In this city, the gods are the protectors of the city, and in exchange for human worship, they protect the city. Religion and the gods serve the ends of the city, and the people worship the gods because the gods are protectors of the city. And if you only have to read the Iliad to see this, right? The gods line up. Who's on the side of Troy and who's on the side of the Achaeans? We see this in real time, in a sense, as we're reading the Iliad. The gods are fighting the wars alongside the human beings. Thus, to be a citizen of a particular city was to be automatically, in a sense, a member of a religious tradition, to practice a set of rituals, to be required to practice those rituals, to understand without a kind of reflection that one's citizenship was coextensive with the worship of the gods of the city. There was not necessarily legislation, wasn't necessarily written, inscribed in a kind of legal code, though in some cases it was, in terms of what was permitted in the public square. But it was simply understood. This is what was done. This is what, when we think of the word culture, right? What's the essence of the word culture? Cult. It's who one worships. It's the cult that one follows. Thus, to describe religion and civic life as binaries, in ways that we've become used to in a post-Christian world, is already to betray the reality on the ground. They were one. For citizens of an ancient city, adherence to one's civil religion then was not a matter of difficulty. It didn't have divided loyalties like you might have if you were an Augustinian, where the city of man and the city of God might make conflicting demands upon you. One's identity and self-definition was bound up in the city, and one's identity as a citizen of a place like Athens or Sparta was expressed through one's worship of the gods of these cities. And of course, we have an example of someone who failed in their civic and religious duties. And you all know who this is. Socrates. I heard somebody say it. Shout it out. Socrates. What is Socrates accused of? Well, first of all, corrupting the youth, which, if that was the accusation, think of all the professors we had able to haul, in front of the trial. I'm sure not here. Notre Dame's different. Think of all of the people that we might today accuse of corrupting the youth. But the other accusation is believing in gods or introducing new gods into the city. Is doing something in violation of the city, which is to say there are other gods that we should be worshiping. And those of you who like Platonic dialogues, which is one of my favorite things, you see lots of really interesting moments where you see it. Socrates does this all the time. At the very beginning of the Republic, the beginning of the Republic is a conversation where Socrates says, hey, isn't this religious festival great? We're down in the port city here in Athens, Piraeus. We're down by the port. What's the port? Where all the foreigners are, all the ships from all over Greece and the Mediterranean. And they're having this religious festival with a parade of all these different sailors and all these different people from different cities. And Socrates says, yeah, the Athenian festival with our gods, that was great. But you know what? The Thracian one was pretty good too. But the gods of Thrace was pretty good, right? This is the guy who in about a year from now is going to get accused of introducing new gods to the city. And then when he's on trial, in front of the entire Athenian assembly, which is 500 people who are trying him, he keeps invoking this phrase, by the dog. By the dog. Now, if you know what this means, he's invoking one of the Egyptian gods. Have you ever seen the giant, big statue of the dog god? This is who he's talking about. So here he is on trial for introducing new gods in the city, and every few minutes he's saying, by the dog. I'm guilty. It's another way of sort of declaring that. He's charged with impiety and found guilty and condemned to death. The other example of creating one city is another example is Rome, which I'll talk about in a second. Another example is theocracy. Now, in civil religion, we could say that the gods, in a sense, serve the city. They serve the ends of the city. Theocracy, in some ways, reverses the claim, which is the gods are, in some ways, the priests or the prophets are the rulers of the city. And we follow not the laws that the gods support, we follow God's laws. We follow the laws that God requires of us. And in following God's laws, we are, in a sense, governed by the theocrats, by the believers, so that the laws of the city are the laws of God. And two examples of this in major civilizations would be ancient Egypt, in which the king of Egypt is also the head of the religion, in a sense. And another example would be modern Islam, maybe ancient Islam as well, in which the Quran is the law, in which the leader, the Ayatollah, is the prophet. He is the religious leader as well as the political leader of the society, in which there is no gap between the city of God and the city of man. The city is an exemplification of the city of God. Now, this idea that there's one city in some ways suggests that, and the example of Socrates suggests that these are places in which you either are a member in good standing, a worshiper in good standing, and therefore a citizen in good standing, or you're not. But I want to suggest it's a little bit more of a complicated relationship. While civil religion, to take the first of these examples, which I think is more central in the Western tradition, served the essential social purpose of binding a people to a polity and conferring upon it the imprimatur of divinity. The strength and identity of the citizenry to their cities was so defining and comprehensive that in many respects, many forms of civil religion could be surprisingly flexible. They could be surprisingly, they could be a certain amount of ease and acceptance of, let's say, views that were a little bit offbeat, maybe not entirely in keeping with the gods of the city. And a good example of this is, we go back to our friend Socrates, who everybody knew was a peculiar guy. It wasn't a secret that he was a strange guy. And he's not prosecuted by the city, actually. 3 malcontents in the city bring the charges. And they're largely brought because of a set of political circumstances, and he's sort of seen as a sort of bit of a scapegoat. He's 78 years old. If he's really a problem, he's been able to live for a long time without being bothered. So the case of Socrates itself, even though we sort of see it as the singular case of a civil religion being intolerant, it's actually striking that there's a kind of flexibility. Another example we could point to is that of our Savior, of Jesus Christ, who of course also is often mentioned alongside Socrates as an example of someone who doesn't enjoy religious liberty within a society that has an instituted civil religion, Rome. But of course, as we know, this is also very complicated. It's not Rome that wants to put him to death. If we read the Gospel, what we see is Pontius Pilate's like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. Go take him, do something, take him away from me. I don't want to have, go have your priest examine him. I find no guilt in him, he says at one point. The Jews want him to be prosecuted because they believe he is a heretic. He doesn't follow the law. Jesus has answered, has been asked to try to trap him, right? Do we owe Caesar taxes? And Jesus gives a pretty acceptable answer for any Roman. So, pay your taxes. That's not our concern. What's really maybe most striking about not just Jesus' eventual arrest and persecution and death is not only the fact that Rome is slow to condemn him, but of course it takes place in the context in which Rome is pretty tolerant of the existence of the entire Jewish religion. Not seeking to eliminate the Jewish religion. They're tolerant of it. And Rome is an example of a civil religion that's pretty capacious. Right? They have their official gods, but they're able to sort of tolerate other gods as long as publicly you don't create any disturbances. And the problem with Jesus is that, at least as far as the population is concerned, he is a disturbance. Now notice what Pilate wants to do. He says, Now, I have two people that I could prosecute, or I could condemn at this point. I'm sorry, release. One of them I can release, and one of them we can condemn to death. Don't you want to condemn Barabbas? He's a revolutionary, is what the Gospels tell us. He's the real troublemaker. They say, no, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. You know, Good Fridays, you have to go out and you have to shout this out. Yeah, give us Barabbas. Right. Crucify him, crucify him. Rome is very quick to condemn the troublemaker. Jesus, for them, is not a troublemaker. It's okay to have a religious believer who does not publicly acknowledge the gods of the city, as long as they keep the peace. Now, when the Jews themselves cease to keep the peace, they are eliminated, and they are genuinely eliminated. The temple is destroyed, taken apart block by block, and the Jews are slaughtered. So ironically, the civil religion of the ancient city could be extensively tolerant of the variety of religious expressions, as long as they didn't give rise to political instability or threaten a form of civic disturbance. This toleration that existed even in the one city, where it was expected that everyone worshiped the same gods, was based upon the desire for peace. We should have peace. That was the aim. So even what we think of as civic religions, where there's only an approved set of gods, could have expressions of toleration because what it sought above all was peace, civic peace. A revolution comes into being when the true radicalness of Jesus' teachings is realized, something Pilate himself can't know because he doesn't know Jesus' teaching, but which the earliest of the church fathers and the doctors, and especially Augustine, understood with profundity. Its transformational character that was inherent in Jesus' teaching. As the teachings of Jesus became more widely known, examined, as the church develops over time, it's the call of Jesus to have our ultimate allegiance and orientation toward our Heavenly Father and toward what Augustine would call the city of God. That this allegiance was distinct from one's allegiance to one's earthly city. Wasn't necessarily in contradiction to it, but that it was always to be our primary allegiance. And if there was a conflict, there was no question where your primary allegiance lied. And the story of many of the martyrs, whose names, I see some of them back here, whose names that we, on days when we pronounce the litany of the saints, many of those saints are exemplars, and indeed paid the ultimate price for that primary allegiance to the city of God. No longer then, in some ways, could the city be relatively indifferent to the theology of its citizens as long as they supported a basic form and practice of the regime. Instead, under the Christian dispensation, the cities of men were effectively demoted. Their ranking was dropped in relationship to the city of God. Notice what this means then. This limits the claims of politics over our most essential being, our souls, the depth of our beliefs, what we think our ultimate, where we think our ultimate destiny lies, in a place beyond this world, this city. Politics becomes, for the first time, genuinely limited by the existence of this other city, the two cities. This is the origin of our idea of limited government. It wasn't invented by our founding fathers. It wasn't invented by the idea of the state of nature or social contract theory. The idea of limited government has its origins in the idea of two cities and the implications of the two cities. The very rise of what we call constitutionalism in the West, and I was introduced as someone who studies constitutional studies. If we limit ourselves to the study of modern constitutions, we miss the storyline. We've looked at, it's like watching, I don't know the names of the Marvel movies, but Infinity Wars before you've seen Iron Man 2. You don't even know what the heck they're talking about. Who's Bucky? What's the heck's happening here? They're connecting with the youth. Corrupting the youth. The beginnings, the origins of constitutionalism in the West arguably lie in this distinction between the two cities. what limits the government? What limits the state? What limits the claims of the state? It's not checks and balances. It's not a Senate and a House. It's the fact that there is a horizon beyond what we think of as our immediate horizon. And the limited powers of the state are implied in the fact that there are allegiances beyond the state itself. This used to be well understood by people in my discipline, political philosophy, and it's been largely forgotten because we don't study this anymore. We don't study the origins of constitutionalism. But in his important book, The Growth of Political Thought in the West, Charles McElwain, who was a political philosopher at Harvard University, pointed to this arc in the West and connected modern constitutionalism to this theological development in the West. At base, what McElwain argued was that limitations upon the state, what we think of as modern constitutionalism, was not born initially of political philosophy, but arose from the core of Christian theology. And it arose from the primacy of the human allegiance to the city of God, which oriented Christians and their vision heavenward, but which had significant political implications. And the most significant of these political implications was that the state itself was limited when it came to the affairs of the church. That there was, because of the distinctness of the city of God and the city of man, and because the church was the city of God on earth, imperfect, filled with all kinds of human error. We know this very well from our church, but nevertheless, it was the embodiment of the city of God in this time and place. Our allegiance to the primary allegiance to the city of God meant that the church was in a place that was, in a sense, separate from and superior to the state. Rather than religion serving the state, in a Christian world, the state was understood as, in some senses, serving or supporting the church as the pilgrimage of the people of the church in this time and place. Now, of course, this was true in theory, but wasn't true in fact for much of the early church because it wasn't a Christian civilization. So guess what? When you were a Christian living in this civilization, think about being a Christian in Rome. You were worshiping a God who wasn't the God of the city. Not a lot of toleration there. Lots of Christians got eaten by lions, mauled by bears, all kinds of terrible things in the arena. And again, a lot of those martyrs, the blood of the martyrs flows under the regime of Rome. There was no expectation. Christians at that time didn't say, hey, what about our Christian liberty? What about our religious liberty? Hey, Caesar. Remember religious liberty? None of the Christians were saying that. They didn't expect it in that time and place. They understood we are in contradiction. We are a contradiction to this way of organizing a human society. The first actual emanation and realization, or at least experience, of the idea of the liberty of the church, and it wasn't called religious liberty, it was called liberty of the church, was when civilization becomes dominantly Christian. And the leaders and the people, what McElwain describes as, quote, both the ecclesiastics and the politiques, the people involved in the church and the people involved in the city, understood alike that the state in some ways was subordinate ultimately in its relationship to the church. One sees this, for example, and this is very just characteristic. I just selected this one example. He's not well known, and I think this is actually the point. He's not very well known, but he's a very typical thinker of the 13th century, Henry of Bracton. Very Thomistic in his thinking, but he was writing in a book called The Laws and Customs of England. This is before Thomas More is being persecuted, and this is what he has to say. The king has a superior, namely God. Likewise, the law through which he was made king, the law has a superior. That law is God. That law, the superior of the law is God. Likewise, his curia, his court, that is the earls and the barons, since earls, comites, are so called for being associates of the king. And he who has an associate has a master. And so if the king be without a bridle, that is, without law, they should put a bridle upon him, lest they themselves, along with him, be without a bridle. Notice, this is a wonderful encapsulation of the idea of constitutionalism. Now, when we think of constitutionalism, we think of the second half. The king should be, or the sovereign should be bridled by other countervening powers. So this kind of, here checks and balances here, right? The different orders of society. We would think today, House, Senate, Supreme Court, we should check each other. But at the origin of this is the idea that unless the king is under law, and that law is understood as ultimately under God, the king is without a bridle. That's the ultimate source of the limitation on the king. And that's the source of the legitimacy, or the only legitimacy of the king. The king's authority ultimately derives from divine authority and is thereby limited by that authority. The freedom of the church, then, as McIlwain describes this, was manifest in a number of sort of practical forms. Here's what McIlwain writes. The immunity of the clergy, the mutual limits of spiritual and temporal jurisdiction, the obligations of church property, and even obscurely the questions of supremacy. And a study of these institutions and practices discloses a steady advance in the consciousness of its distinctive character and peculiar rights by the church. Now, if we really begin to look at each of these examples of what constitutes freedom of the church, the immunity of the clergy. The clergy are immune from certain of the laws of the city. This could be a problem, as we're well aware. But what it also means is that the city cannot simply just decide to imprison someone for having the wrong belief. The city can't simply do what it did to Thomas More if the city recognizes the authority of the church. The freedom to develop doctrine, the rights and duties of property, why churches are not taxed, which now applies to things like universities and other of these institutions. Why are these places tax-free? This has its origins in Christian liberty. The state, right, the power to tax is the power to destroy. The state can't have the power to destroy these institutions. And watch, this is something that's being debated today, whether to tax religious institutions that don't conform to the modern state. All of these and more point to that the origin of what we think of as religious liberty actually lies in a different way of thinking, which is the freedom of the church. Now, as I suggested, in ancient cities there was no expectation that one would have religious liberty. It was simply, to be a Christian meant you were likely going to be persecuted. It certainly wasn't out of the realm of possibility. And this was something that none other than Jesus Christ told us. Lest we forget in John 15, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. And this is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. If they treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. In other words, expect to be persecuted. Expect to be hated. What's stunning and surprising, and maybe we know Jesus knew everything in advance, but nevertheless, the Jesus who didn't tell us everything was that there would be a period in time, at least, where there would be a kind of Christian civilization in which there would be freedom of the church, because there would be two cities. Because most people in that civilization understood there would be two cities. Now, something else just worth noting, and I'll just mention this in passing, is that the church could also be tolerant of other religions. And it wasn't always, but it could be tolerant of other religions. In many cities in ancient Europe where you go, you'll see ghettos where Jews lived. It wasn't always the nicest part of town, but it was a place where Jews could live. Sometimes relations were tense and sometimes unpleasant. But that toleration existed not for the same reasons, not for peace, not for the existence of peace. Toleration meant you could put up with something. It didn't mean that you were indifferent to it. You could put up with something. Think of the word toleration. Its original meaning is the way we still use it in engineering. What a metal can tolerate, the tolerance level, until it bends or breaks. Toleration was, in some senses, had its aim or its understanding was, we know and believe what we believe is right. And we can put up with this in part because we believe what we believe is right, We hope you will come to believe what we believe is right. But we don't necessarily require you to. But it's different in some ways than saying it's merely peace. Its ultimate aim is salvation. Now, how am I doing? Probably way over. Here's the end of the story. The end of the story is we have, okay, we'll go really quick, Protestant Reformation, Thomas More, things get all unsettled. We have lots of disagreement about what religion is and isn't, the two cities, and so a lot of people start to say, maybe this two cities idea was a bad idea. Maybe it's not going to work out. How about if we go back to the idea of one city? And the first one to propose this, well, arguably, it's probably Machiavelli, but one of the first ones to propose this is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, notice the illustration at the front of the Leviathan. This is the king, the sovereign, and notice what he holds. He holds the sword, the power of the sovereign, and over here, all along this side, is castles and war-making instruments and armies fighting at night. And over in this arm, he holds the crozier of the bishop. And notice what's over here, churches, the mitre, and disputation, and here's a council down here, there's a war over here, a council over here, similar action, different appearance. All the people are contained within the sovereign, and the sovereign holds the power of both the sword and the crozier. We make the city one. We recombine the city because the two cities has proven to be difficult to maintain. Difficult to maintain. It's complex, constant, and if you study this history of Christianity, constant questions about where to draw lines. Where's the line between secular and religious power? Hobbes wants to make it easy. There's no more lines. It's all held by the sovereign. He'll solve all the problems. You have a religious disputation, you go to the king. The question we have before us with modern liberalism, are we two cities or one? And here's where we have a really interesting debate today. I think this is the crux of the debate, certainly within, I think, the Catholic world. Many believe that liberalism is modeled on Christianity. It's a kind of way to take the Christian understanding of the two cities and enfold it within the political order. And that's reflected, among other things, in our First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And also shall not, shall not, I forget the word, sorry. Abridge, thank you, I was thinking interrupt. Abridge the free exercise thereof. So, two things. No established religion. Right, so John Locke, and our founding fathers say, okay, we're not going to do quite this. We're going to have separation. There'll be a crozier and a sword. They'll be separate. They'll have, in a sense, they won't have anything to do with each other. No establishment of religion. But the sovereign will not be able to interfere in the exercise of religion. So there can be, in a sense, two cities. Everyone can enjoy their sort of private lives as religious believers, and then their public lives as citizens. And the city will no longer, in any way, interfere in the religious beliefs of the people. And this is complicated. And on this question really lies, in many ways, the challenge that we face. Because Locke is, in some ways, in some guises, he seems Christian. And there are a lot of people who argue, well, John Locke's a good Christian. He's just translating Christian doctrine into a kind of secular form. There's a lot of ways of reading John Locke as an Hobbesian. That really what he wants to do is settle this problem through the kind of appearance of two cities, while in fact grounding it more deeply in a kind of modern form of one city. We see this, I think, especially, we see evidence of both sides of this case in his most famous work on religious liberty and the question of religious liberty, his letter concerning toleration. And in this letter concerning toleration, he makes arguments that are very familiar to a Christian. The state should not interfere, shouldn't dictate, shouldn't tell you what you should believe. But on the other hand, society needs ways that it can cohere. We don't want to live in a world that Hobbes says exists without a sovereign. And a world that exists without a sovereign is a state of nature, where life is nasty, brutish, nasty, poor, solitary, and short. We don't want to live in a state of nature. So what can bind us together if it's not like the sovereign who runs everything? It says we have to empower the sovereign to be able to make determinations of what religious belief is acceptable and what religious belief is not acceptable. So at the end of the day, a sovereign will make decisions about what religious belief is acceptable and what religious belief is unacceptable. And Locke, as I sometimes call him, Locke gives us two examples of this. The first example of this are atheists, whom he says should be given no toleration. And the reason that they should be given no toleration, he says, is that they do not keep their oaths and covenants. Now, if you premise or base your social order on the social contract, we will all respect each other's rights. And then you have people among you who may not fear God, and you don't have that sovereign. How are you going to sort of ensure that, or at least have confidence that people will be likely to keep their oaths? Have enough people around who believe in God, and maybe they'll fear that if they break their oaths, they'll go to hell. So we can't have atheists. Those are people who will break their oaths. The second group we can't have are people, he says, who give obeisance to a foreign potentate, to a foreign ruler, by whom he means Catholics, who see the Pope as more authoritative than the king. And this was Thomas More's problem. Thomas More wouldn't sign an oath in which he said, I abjure the Pope's rule, and I will obey the new head of the Church of England, the King of England. So to abjure the Pope is, in a sense, to say, I am only going to live in one city. We can't have any believers who will not, at the end of the day, agree to the determination of the sovereign, the political sovereign, that certain practices or beliefs are out of bounds. And to this extent, I think here Locke really reveals, let's say, a kind of Hobbesian side, the recreation of the one city. And that the purpose and end, Locke argues, for religious toleration that we put up with people to some extent, people of different beliefs, up to some point, is for the purposes of peace. It's for the purposes of peace. We keep the peace. Everyone gets along. In this sense, in kind of its substance and essence, it's really very little different than the one city solution of antiquity. It just looks like it's more Christian, because it sounds like we live in two cities. But in fact, at the end of the day, notice what happens today. If there is a dispute about whether or not a religious belief or practice or exercise is problematic or not, we don't go to the bishop, we don't go to the priest, we don't go to the Pope and ask, am I acting in ways that go beyond my role as a Christian? We go to the courts, and the courts will determine whether or not your religious exercise, belief, expression, and so forth is legitimate. The city has the final say. It's exactly what Hobbes wanted. It just looks nicer. The sword is a little more hidden now. Today, as Christians living in a liberal world, we recognize, and that's why we have this lecture, that's why we have these programs. Notre Dame has an entire institute or center devoted to religious liberty. We recognize that religious liberty is being hemmed in everywhere we turn. And we believe that we are owed religious liberty because we live in a liberal regime. We have mistaken it as in a sense, a following subsequent chapter of the Christian two cities. When in fact, what I want to suggest tonight, at least plant as a possibility, what we are actually living in is one city, in which we have no real expectation, and should have no real expectation, that we will be granted religious liberty. That's our position right now. Why aren't we beginning, we just have to bring a case and get religious liberty. My suggestion tonight is that if this remains our strategy and our expectation, we are likely, and indeed I would suggest, we are destined to be disappointed. Rather, I think what we really have to consider is if we really want freedom, freedom to worship, freedom of the church, we have to think about the possibility that in some way, shape, or form, in a very different way, doubtless a very different form than we had in a previous time, we will need to have both ecclesiastics and politiques who recognize the fundamental allegiances that are owed to the city of man and to the city of God. Which means, in some senses, we'll have to move beyond liberalism to something quite different and possibly quite then. Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. And it is so nice to see Patrick Deneen again after so many years. He's at ND, and I did my graduate work at Notre Dame. And there was a very large intramural basketball tournament called Bookstore Basketball. I think it was the largest in the country. And I was from the political science department. And our professors and students cobbled together a team, and it was called Solitary, Poor, Nasty, Brutish, and Short.
I would have fit right in.
So the problem of religious liberty, that was a terrific paper. The point that there is no abstract or pure form of religious liberty is well taken. And that religion either defines or is in some important respects defined by the political order, I think is a crucial insight. And what I would like to do in my limited time, I've been asked to give roughly 10 minutes of remarks, is to add some evidence in its favor. So to support this thesis and move it forward.
Jeanne, they're having trouble hearing you in the back.
Okay, maybe I will use the mic?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Is this better? Yes. Can you hear me? Okay, very good. Part of the reason behind the success of the new one city Deneen describes is, to my mind, that the omnicompetent, omnipresent secular state with quite ambitious designs regarding human formation has been erected with a good bit of subtlety, and that its structures evince a certain kind of fairness. There's an apparent fairness to its structures. We've been told that we live within a neutral state, a state that doesn't take sides in controverted questions. Rather, it protects the freedom and equality of all citizens, irrespective of their beliefs, so irrespective of which other city they might belong to. So to use Rawlsian categories, do you remember him? There is no comprehensive doctrine informing our legislative processes or our judicial decisions. No comprehensive doctrines, religious or otherwise. Rather, we live in a procedurally pluralistic state. I'd like to suggest that this is a fiction, and a dangerous one. There is no benign neutrality operative in the liberal state that we inhabit. And it's not, I don't think, because of malice or ill will or some kind of conspiracy against religious believers. Rather, as my colleague at the Institute, David Crawford, has observed so clearly, law always mediates some vision of reality. It's always informed by some notion, whether explicit or implicit, of an answer to these kinds of questions. What does it mean to be human? What is a good life? What is justice? And behind these questions lie deeper ones, the answer to which ultimately find expression in our public life, whether directly or indirectly. Questions about the nature and destiny of man. What is good? What is evil? Is there a God? What do we owe him? I find much evidence for Deneen's thesis about the one city theory of liberalism compelling, and it's in two areas that come immediately to mind because they are areas that I have studied and they're areas that I care a great deal about, namely abortion jurisprudence and what the acronym SOGI jurisprudence, namely sexual orientation and gender identity jurisprudence. I would like to suggest that in this area of the law, there are thick assumptions at work, comprehensive doctrines at work, assumptions which arise from the city of man and that are in direct opposition to the operative tenets of the city of God. With respect to the first area of case law, the nature of the human person and the beginning of life is in question. And an answer is given thereto. We are implicitly reckoning with the question of whether there is a creator and what are the limits, if any, to human autonomy. We find this so strikingly apparent in Roe v. Wade in 1973 and reiterated again with a different nomenclature in Casey in 1992. Let's go back to Roe for just a moment. At the beginning of their decision, the majority of the justices in Roe adopt a posture of epistemic and disciplinary humility. Okay, epistemic relating to what we can know, how we can know what we know. The justices admit that the judiciary is not competent to adjudicate such a complex question as when life begins. In essence, they're saying it's beyond our professional competence. We are going to remain neutral arbiters of the law, and so we have to bracket the big questions about human life and its beginning. But the court immediately issues a decision that rests upon an answer to that momentous question. We can't tell you, Harry Blackman confesses, whether the unborn are persons. But for all intents and purposes, we are going to assume that they're not. And so we will not afford them any legal protection. That is not a neutral answer. And its animating philosophical assumptions emerge from the city of man, from one of the two cities. But the decision is forwarded, in fact, as, what would you say, a species of neutral public reasoning, but it isn't. So too does the conception of freedom articulated in the Casey decision. This is by now famous, and I'm sure familiar to some of you at least. In reaffirming the abortion right, the justices in Casey say this about the nature of liberty. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. That is a staggering proposal. That's what it means to be free, that you can define the world. The anthropology at work here is radically non-Christian. And I would say in terms of its metaphysics, it's also nominalist. So we have a case of singularities, the individual as the arbiter of the meaning of reality. And of course, the great irony is the Supreme Court would lose its competence and its authority as the ultimate decision makers in terms of what the fundamental law is. The anthropology at work here is radically non-Christian, and it needs to be recognized as such. Then we can have an honest conversation about whose vision of reality should inform our public life. As of now, we have one city, but its animating assumptions are not coming from the one city of Christendom, for instance. As it is, a host of very controversial assumptions are smuggled into the law under the guise of neutrality, fairness, and equality. Those might be our gods. Those might be in our pantheon. I've touched briefly on liberty in life, let me touch very briefly on the question of equality, and then I look forward to a lively conversation. I'm going to move ahead to the Bostock decision in more recent years. In short, the Bostock decision, written by Justice Gorsuch, claims that adverse employment decision based upon an employee's sexual orientation or gender identity violates federal law. Because the Supreme Court holds that the relationship between our embodiment as male and female and our personal subjectivity as moral agents is arbitrary. But these are very serious, very profound metaphysical judgments about the nature of human identity, excuse me. And the implications that this kind of judgment holds are vast. As my dear friend and colleague and Hannah Keegan's uncle has put it, it is impossible to redefine human nature for just one person. So in redefining what it means to be human, what it means to be embodied, what it means to be an agent, the court has redefined it for all of us. You can't circumscribe this. Once we recognize this, whether we're talking about the assumptions about life in Roe or the assumptions about human sexuality and personhood in Bostock, then we can begin an honest conversation about whose vision of reality should shape the way we live together. The vision of the city of man or the city of God. Thank you.
Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. I can speak up. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you.
Press some voice, that's right.
I learned how to do this when I was a sergeant in the Army.
Sir.
First, I'd like to begin my remarks by suggesting that we should thank God and the political system in which we live that allows us tonight to come together in this group and discuss issues of this nature freely and openly. That is not happening in the Ukraine today. I want us to be aware that there is a reality to political theory where people's lives are lost when we have disagreements. We live in a world that is sometimes extremely violent, where people are mean to each other and they are Hobbesian. We sought to escape that, and that's why we have the liberal order that we have today. It was an effort to try to be more tolerant. So first I'd like to make that appreciation that we've escaped the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy. We're at the top of the apex, where we have this ability to have this kind of discussion tonight, which I thank God and my fellow citizens for allowing us to do. Thank you. I prepared for a lot of different approaches for tonight's presentation, not really knowing exactly what would be presented. And so I came here prepared tonight to talk about liberalism in particular and how we define liberalism differently over time. Because in my vision of the world, I see liberalism as a dynamic process. It's not the traditional liberalism that we associate with the world in the 1600s. It's a liberalism that all of us have contributed to changing over the last several hundred years. Just as our society has changed, the way that we view our relationships have changed too, and our institutions that we use to enable us to make those changes have changed as a result. of the different way we look at issues in the context of the time. So tonight, I want to tell you that I'm not of the one city idea. I don't think life has to be an either-or proposition. I believe that we can live in two cities and be comfortable in both of them. Because even though it's a paradox, we live with paradoxes every day in our regular life. Paradox is not alien to us. It's not that we have to make one choice to love our neighbor or hate them. We can live perfectly well next to our neighbor and accept the fact that they are different than us. And we expect back from them the same thing. This is the liberal institutions that we should be supporting. The ones that allow us to have that freedom. And don't get me wrong, this is as free as we can get. It isn't as though there's some absolute freedom we work towards. We accept limitations on our freedom all the time. Just as humans do for each other. We accept that there are limitations to what we can expect in our relationships with our political institutions. Just because we live in a democracy doesn't mean we're always going to get fairness and justice. Ask African Americans who were agitating to be treated as human beings for 400 years before we acknowledge that their even existence. Our liberal institutions changed as a result of that agitation. I don't know that a political expediency is all that bad. I think there are benefits to political expediency. I don't think we have perfect language to describe some perfect theoretical world that we're all working to inhabit. We're making it up as we go along. And political expediency, the desire for safety, security, and some degree of freedom, supports us understanding that we are not going to make perfect institutions. And all of us aren't going to be happy with every decision that's made. The idea that to some degree we benefit from these institutions should be perhaps sufficient enough that we continue to protect them. Because I don't know what the alternative is to that. Political expediency teaches toleration. That's not a bad word in my vocabulary. Perhaps you can think about your own lives where you've been tolerant of people who might have mistreated you, maybe not even on purpose, but you understand that it's only one part of the complexity of their personality or who they are as a person, and you are tolerant of that. I don't know that tolerance is necessarily a bad word. I do know that we cannot replace a godlike figure in our political system with our Constitution. It's the best we can do on earth. And I don't think it's such a bad thing to think that we're muddling through in this scenario. Our security is to some degree guaranteed by these institutions, and they change over time, and we have the power to make those changes. I think this is often lost in this discussion about either or. Where do we place responsibility for how society is organized? Too often we forget Aristotle's suggestion that a democracy depends upon good citizens who are actively engaged, who are knowledgeable, who are working for the benefit of the community as a whole. And that community that we live in is quite diverse. I don't think we live in a Hobbesian world, although I mentioned the Ukraine today, and I'm sure for them, they feel this is a Hobbesian world. We live in more of the Lockean world, where it's up to us to respect each other as citizens, even in our diverse thinking. in order that we ourselves might be respected. Our sovereign authority in this case is our political institutions, our liberal institutions. And the fragmentation of our loyalties demands a pluralist solution. We are not all of one thinking on every issue. We have divided loyalties. Madison counted on this to make sure that we would have some degree of freedom, that not one faction would control us. So the question becomes, do we have religious liberty? I'm not sure that religious liberty is actually defined tonight as to what it means. We're in a chapel. We pray to the religion of our preference. There are people in our society that feel very differently than Christianity in terms of their religion. Are they any less a citizen of this city than we are? Pluralism doesn't argue that there is a perfection of fairness and justice. What it promotes is the ability for us to argue and find some temporary solution to an issue, to conflicts between us. Those conflicts never end. When I'm in class speaking with my students and I'm talking about current political issues, I could just as well say these are the same issues that Aristotle discussed 3,000 years ago. The questions really don't change, the context does. What is beyond liberalism? What can be beyond liberalism? There is no perfect government form. So I'm going to finish my remarks tonight by suggesting that we ask of ourselves, what questions should we be asking in a democracy? Equity, responsibility, speak truth to lies, setting an example to others, understanding that our own freedom depends upon appreciating and defending the liberty of others, practicing tolerance. Thank you.
Dr. Deneen will say a few remarks, and then our Associate Provost and Philosopher, Dr. Jay Langeth, will serve as the moderator. I think the first question will be Professor Caitlin Dwyer, and you have the opportunity to ask questions by filling out. Is there someone who's passing out the papers? Yeah. Put your hand up if you want to ask a question, and he'll give you a piece of paper to write it, and we'll have Professor Dwyer ask the first question once Dr. Deneen finishes. Jay, would you come up here and join them?
Well, thank you for both those thoughtful, really thought-provoking remarks. I think, in a way, I would love actually to have the two of you talk to each other, because I think you describe, listening to the two of you, I can, in some ways, discern a truth in both of your remarks that don't entirely mesh. A kind of empirical reality that I think we all experience in both of these remarks that are in some tension with each other. And it's probably something that most of us can identify and maybe even identify with. Jeanne suggests, we live in a world in which this thing called liberalism, the liberal regime we live in, while appearing, as she put it, to be a regime of benign neutrality, in fact has very deeply seated commitments that will eventually reveal themselves, manifest themselves in the majesty of the law. And the law tells us what to do. The law orders us, backed ultimately by the power of the Leviathan. And if you cross the Leviathan, you will find out that the Leviathan's sword is extremely powerful. So in this sense, I don't see a world that is diverse and tolerant and pluralist in quite the same way as JT suggests. And yet in my day-to-day dealings with my neighbors and my friends, my colleagues, that is the world I inhabit. I very much recognize that world that JT describes. Not in, perhaps, the sort of official doctrine of the regime in which we inhabit, but what Tocqueville regarded as, or described as the kind of, what he saw as the characteristic American quality, in which we were all liberal in our philosophy. We would spout constantly about the importance of individual liberty, autonomy, being free from each other. He said, but actually when you look at Americans and how they actually act, we're better than that. He said, and I love this line from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, we do more honor to our philosophy than to ourselves. We talk about our philosophy as our motivation, but in fact, we're better than our philosophy. We're better than what we officially claim that we are. And I guess we do have a real challenge in front of us. Because I think for many of us, we experience everyday life, especially at the very local level, with our friends and neighbors, our fellow students, teachers and students together, in quite that way that JT described. And it's very beautiful and an inspiring way to think about ourselves. But I think we also experience the world increasingly in which there is increasingly not a really benignly neutral regime. It's revealing itself to us. And if my talk was a little longer, what I actually would want to suggest is that we have moved from a liberalism that began as a form of civil religion to a liberalism that is now a theocracy. A theocracy that is in some ways not officially a theocracy, but which has all the hallmarks of a theocracy. That is run by a class of priests who tell us what the truth is based upon a belief system that is in some senses grounded in a set of religious beliefs about what the human being is. It's exactly what Jeanne was talking about. A set of deep metaphysical presuppositions about the nature of the human person that directly contradict, of course, as Jeanne pointed out, a Christian understanding. And if you hold those views, the power of the state will be used ultimately to suppress you and all of the various organs that are influenced by the state. In the class I visited today, I talked about the ways that as a college professor at a Catholic university, I feel increasingly nervous about talking about things like gender and abortion and sexuality, because I know academic freedom will protect me if I talk about liberalism in the abstract. But if I run afoul of the Human Resource Department, which takes its cues from, among other things, Bostock decision, I can be fired from a Catholic university. That doesn't strike me as tolerant. That doesn't strike me as diverse or pluralist. That strikes me as increasingly theocratic, in which the God of today is the God portrayed in Hobbes. So I think we have these two worlds, in a sense, which don't necessarily reflect two cities. It reflects basic decencies that we all experience that are increasingly under threat from what I see as a regime that is increasingly, in some senses, has all the trappings of theocracy, as opposed to civil religion. And so my counsel tonight is that we have to be aware or cautious that the demand or expectation of religious liberty in this condition is perilous and fragile, and that we may have to call upon or rely upon a different set of sources that recognize that what we're appealing to will not be granted, or is not likely to be granted. And we have to begin to think either, as Jesus counseled us, that the world will hate us, or perhaps again think about a way of how we collectively live in the two cities.
Okay, I think Ray said that Caitlin was going to ask the first question.
Thank you, Dr. Deneen, Dr. Schindler, and Dr. Spence for your remarks. So my question, I'm going to cheat and ask two. The first one is, what might a new political order look like that is rooted in objective truth but still makes room for authentic religious freedom? And then what role does technology have in imposing the liberal worldview?
And we have 12 hours.
Do you want me to take a stab at that?
Can you repeat? I could not hear.
Okay, I think, well, if I heard correctly, the first question, which is unfortunately too massive to tackle, is what would a political order look like that is not, or that, as I suggested, may need to follow the current order. And the second question is, what role does technology play in what we were discussing? And I may actually kick the second question to Jeanne, because I know this is a particular area of interest of hers, as it is of mine, but I think it's more appropriately answered by Jeanne. I guess in terms of the first question, and it is a question that would take quite a long time to discuss. I think it is, in fact, here's in some ways the hopeful case. It's also a case we have to be cautious about. That, as Jeanne suggested, the liberal order, this modern order, was patterned in a very shrewd way, patterned on a Christian understanding. It wasn't, civil religion in the Roman or Athenian form. It didn't demand obeisance to one God and expect obeisance to one God. At least after Hobbes. Hobbes did, but after Hobbes it did not. It rather viewed that the state could sort of control the conflicts, could keep the peace through a kind of selective use of force, only when necessary, and only when the religious beliefs ran counter to the fundamental assumptions of liberalism. And as I think Jeanne's comments point out, those fundamental assumptions become clearer and clearer over time. But the fact that it was patterned on a Christian assumption of the two cities, in some senses means that it can be repatterned, if you follow. In other words, it doesn't require, we don't require a kind of radical revolution to remake the world in some different image. Rather, it seems to me that the existing pattern that exists through at least a certain understanding of the institutions, and here again I'll rely on the arguments of Alexis de Tocqueville, whom I find always very helpful, allow for ways that I would suggest in very small ways, a small shift in how we understand those patterns. Maybe not immediately, but over a long term, could turn the direction of where we're going. Could turn the direction. In the same way that when you begin to turn a ship, and the Titanic comes to mind, maybe it's an apt description. When you turn the ship, the first 10 minutes afterwards, you're not going to be very far from where you started to turn from. But over the course of an entire journey, you'll end up in a very different place. You'll go from Alaska to South America because of that slight turn. So what would changing some of the basic assumptions look like? And I think they are reflected in some of Jeanne's comments. What would it look like to begin to change the assumption about what metaphysical assumptions about human beings are through our law, through our understanding of how human beings are understood through law? This would require a kind of different training and approach to the law that we currently have, but it's not a bridge too far. But I think more than that, we should and ought to begin to think about ways, for example, I think many of us feel with a sense of immediacy and sometimes almost pain, the demands of the modern world for our lives to be always that of usefulness, of productivity, of being, in some ways, a contributor to an economic order. Here I will use Jeanne as an example. Jeanne over dinner tonight was talking about the way in which she gave up a tenured position at Villanova University. Is that right? Yes, Villanova University in order to be a mother, in order to care for her children. She was doing, in some senses, the opposite of what our society tells her is what good work is what good, useful, productive work is. What would we have to do as a society to say, this is the really important work? The work of raising children. I'm not just saying a mother, I'm saying parenting is the really important work. This is a priority that we have as a society. We wouldn't have to have a revolution in the political order. It would change our economic order to some extent. But what would it take to inform our political order with a different set of assumptions? If we begin to think at very simple levels of these kinds of decisions and the incentives we have for certain decisions, it requires not a complete revolution of the political order. because the pattern is there. It begins to populate our pattern, current pattern, with a different pattern. But it can still lie on that pattern. So I hope that is suggestive, at least, of ways we can begin to think about a change to the political order in which the danger is always the temptation of like radical revolution. Right? We have to overthrow the current order. That never turns out well. In some ways, the allusion to Ukraine tonight is not inapt. But beginning with a kind of the accumulation of different patterning to move us to what I think would look ultimately like something of a different regime.
That's a very thoughtful question and a thoughtful first answer to it. I don't want to speculate right now as to what shape a new political order would take institutionally. That would be a very complicated thing to work out. But I would want to suggest, as Tracy Rowland has done, that a new political order could tolerate or even promote a juridical autonomy of the state, let's say vis-a-vis the church, but not an ontological autonomy. In other words, that the state would have to be, and every state should be, responsible to an order that it did not create, and that it would acknowledge. And there is language to this effect, of course, in our founding documents. There's a tradition there that I think could be mined, but we would have to infuse it with a more robust substance. But think of nature and nature's God. Okay? The grounding of natural rights in, broadly speaking, a Christian tradition. Now, I'd have to qualify that in a number of ways. But to undertake a kind of refounding, as it were, of the American experiment. I think that is a possibility. I mean, in fact, I think it's an exigency. Second, with respect to the role of technology, that's a terrific question. Because something like the Byrne decision from the New York State Supreme Court that preceded Roe by about 3 years, if you can believe this, in the Byrne decision, which legalized the practice of abortion in New York State public hospitals, the justices referred to the unborn child as a human entity. They used the language of a human entity. That's a stratagem to dehumanize and to distance. It's a terribly sterile and clinical use of language. Likewise, you wouldn't have Bostock apart from a technocratic society. Right? No society that was robustly in touch with nature, with the organic, natural forms, could have issued a decision like Bostock. And so one very modest proposal, and this is modest, and my children are not happy about it, but I've tried to start a movement in Hyattsville, Maryland, of families who are taking the pledge, not, mind you, the 19th century Irish pledge. I mean, my husband and I belong to a wine club, after all. But the Postman Pledge is what we're calling it, named in honor of Neil Postman, the media critic and educator, who foresaw some of the difficulties with technology. So the Postman Pledge families are pledging not to give their children smartphones, not to let them use social media, and to try as best as we can as families to curb our use of electronic technologies generally. If I may add one very quick funny anecdote. One of the things we're trying to do positively is to foster traditional, natural means of building community and celebrating together. So I'm hosting a Scottish country dance this Saturday. I fly home tomorrow, and then I have 119 people coming. I've hired the bagpiper for the US Naval Academy, a fiddler, a keyboardist. It's going to be a hoot. But because A, I'm technologically inept, B, I'm cheap, and C, I'm losing my vision. When I wrote the Evite, I selected the only plaid border Evite that I could find that was free. And I wrote the text, and I blasted it to 33 families, but I was only looking at it in the compact view.
I get back 119 RSVPs. Only one of these dear souls had the courage to tell me that when you clicked on the expanded view, it was of the zombie apocalypse. So you had this plaid border, and when I looked at it again, it was plaid border, but it was speckled with blood stains. It was like the plaid border from the grunge, like Kurt Cobain grunge meets the zombie apocalypse. So I sent an email back to this group and said, look, consider the dance a preemptive strike against the ghoulish moguls of social media. So we're gonna see how it goes. But I mean, I want my kids to know about human beings, what's human, not artifice, not simply artifice.
Okay, so I have quite a few fascinating looking questions from members of the audience, which I will start on here. So first of all, can any person or institution be truly neutral and make a neutral decision for a society? In other words, does neutrality really exist? Who wants to?
Boy, I'd love to take a stab at that, if I may. It's a terrific question. And no, I don't think it's possible, even with respect to something like traffic regulations. Okay? I mean, in a certain sense, whether we drive on the left side or the right it's a matter that's inconsequential, right? There's no deep metaphysics behind that. On the other hand, once you peel it back, there is a metaphysical assumption behind it, namely that human life is valuable. Right? And that human life is more valuable than efficiency, for instance. So no, I don't think that the law makes neutral decisions, ultimately. Okay? And especially with respect to the most controverted questions of the day. And they have enormous consequences, as we've seen from the early 1970s on. They shape the way people behave, and as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the law changes people's hearts. So it's a profound exercise in human formation.
Okay. What are the organically American traditions of liberty rooted in the classical tradition that we can draw on in our post-liberal situation? Who do we need to go back and reread?
That's a great question. And I guess I was haltingly suggesting that in some ways the pattern that we know is one that we've discovered and found, certainly Christians and many religious believers, and I think JT's comments really speak to this, are ones in which we find ourselves, I think as you beautifully described it, we don't have to find ourselves necessarily inherently at odds with the cities that we're in. And in many cases, I think as JT was suggesting, we don't in our everyday lives. I think it's especially then we would want to look. So I agree with Jeanne that the law has a kind of majesty and it teaches, but I also think we need to be really attentive to not that these are in any way in tension, but the kind of cultural forms of life that I think ultimately also feed into the law and shape the law. There's a deep interpenetration of law and culture. And I think what we're experiencing today, and this is what I was trying to express earlier, is a growing divide between the two, where our experience of everyday life can be very satisfactory, but increasingly as Christians, as religious believers, it's becoming, one finds that we're living in a hostile time, in a hostile city. So I think we do need to be attentive to reading, thinking about ways of thinking about law and how the law can be informed by non-liberal sources, many of which are compatible with, and indeed I think have deep sources that precede the liberal tradition and which still feed into the American tradition. And here I'll give a shout out to my friend Adrian Vermeule's recent book, Common Good Constitutionalism, which proposes a different way of reading our American Constitution that's consistent with the classical tradition that I was just mentioning. So suggesting that there is a stream of American constitutionalism, a way of understanding it, that is not defined by the liberal presuppositions that have become dominant, especially in some circles of the law world. And this is true of the left legal tradition as well as the right legal tradition. So it's an attack both on living constitutionalism, what we associate with Bader Ginsburg, but also right constitutionalism, originalism. After all, it was Justice Gorsuch, an originalist, who wrote the Bostock decision. This was a conservative, redefining human sexuality in our Constitution. So it's not worked, that tradition, neither of those traditions have worked especially well for this Christian idea of human anthropology. At the same time, I think we need to reinforce, and I think your example of the Scottish dance, and I'll look for my invitation, and in a certain way, I think those of us who are especially well-educated and aware of the kind of the trends of what we call culture today, or what I call anti-culture, are well aware of the way that you have to be resistant to the trends of culture. It's much harder when you're not necessarily a person who's reading the texts and works and thinking through the texts and works that allow you to begin to thinking in some ways against the predominant culture, which is technological, which does shape us, which is not neutral. So what are some of those resources that can help us? Neil Postman is a real good one, and I'm glad you call it the Postman Society. And for young people who don't know the book, Amusing Ourselves to Death was a book that really transformed my view of the world, about media, about technology. Wendell Berry's work, a very popular figure in some circles in your world, but a pretty simple Kentucky farmer who returned to his farm after having a job at New York University, did a kind of version of what Jeanne did, which was to leave the plum job that every academic would dream of in order to go back to his hometown in Kentucky, buy a farm, and farm it for the rest of his life while he wrote books, great books, novels, poems, and essays that make an argument for a life of integration in which our lives are integral. They're integrated, they're not disintegrated. We live lives of disintegration is the default. We expect our lives to, in some ways, not connect. We've got the school life, we've got the church life, we've got the family life, we've got the economic life, the work life. What does it mean to live a life of integrity? To use that word at the root of the word integrated. So I think works like these really begin to teach us not just about the nature of our situation, but how we live in that situation. How we can live in a way that seeks to live a life of integrity that often runs counter to the dominant tradition. Do you want to talk about any of this?
I'll go back to the ship turning idea. I think some of this discussion validates our liberal institutions and their dynamic nature. The ship turning analogy. We practice incrementalism in our society because if we turn that ship too quickly, everybody gets slammed up against the wall. They don't have time to adjust to the changes that are taking place in our society. And sometimes those incremental changes on the ship, the direction that we have the ability to set for that ship, sometimes they're not fast enough for us, and other times they're too fast for us. The reality is you can't satisfy everybody all the time. And the idea of incrementalism allows, at least we can make change that people have the ability to adapt to. And yes, it's political expediency, and that our society is able to be cohesive while those changes are taking place. I don't think anybody wants to go and fight another civil war. That's what happens when we haven't made the change. We haven't given it enough time. Not enough people have bought into the argument, that kind of thing. It can be very frustrating, but at the same time, if our goal is to have a one united community, then we have to be tolerant of each other, and we have to accept that sometimes we don't get things we want as fast as we might want them. Despite the pull of liberalism also, you've heard that people have made decisions, my fellow commentators tonight, have made life decisions on their own. The decision to not integrate technology into the family, that's a family decision. That we don't have to do that. I don't get on Facebook. What a waste of time. What an absolute waste of time. It took me a little time to figure that out, but trying to have an intellectual conversation on there is impossible. So I just said, I don't need this. We have power that we don't use too often. We give the term liberalism. We think it started off as Luke Skywalker and became Darth Vader. We give it human qualities that just are not appropriate. We decide what our liberalism is, but we have to get involved in the political process. And we have to be able to tolerate people that have different opinions than us. So this is a great conversation, but I don't know how we replace liberalism. I think what we should do is, like baseball, continue to try to upgrade it, make it more exciting, and we change the rules of all sorts of institutions so that we can live better with them.
You're a fan of the designated hitter?
I'm a Cincinnati Red fan. We're a National League team.
Thank you. Not all change is good.
Baseball better make some changes soon.
Okay. Ray, how many questions, or how much time would you say we have?
Yeah, about 15 minutes left.
15 minutes, okay. So here's another difficult, I think, interesting question. To what extent do you see the conflict between the cities of man and the cities of God as owing to a conflict between philosophy and theology with respect to accepting revelation?
Oh, that's so interesting.
It's a little above my pay grade.
As far as I understand the question, I guess two responses. The city of God and the city of man do not have to be in contradiction to each other. And I think as Augustine certainly understands it, there will always be a tension, but there can be a drawing nearer or a drawing further apart. And to the extent, I think especially in the Augustinian tradition, but now let's turn to Thomas Aquinas, to the extent, following Thomas Aquinas, that the city of man conforms to certain fundamental understandings of the human person and the nature of the human community that are comprehensible both through the means of human reason, thereby philosophy, as well as confirmed in revelation, therefore through Christian faith, the Bible. To the extent that human communities conform to what he calls the common good, to the summum bonum, which includes, it includes things that we would think of, prosperity, relative degree of prosperity, order, security, but it also ultimately points us to the summum bonum, salvation. To the extent that the human order conforms to that vision of what the human good is, human society, the city of man and the city of God, can be drawn closer together, and thereby we do not live in contradiction. So I don't think that there's a necessary conflict between, obviously, philosophy and faith. In fact, as Aquinas argues, they're fundamentally compatible. And this is why, for students out there who have to take classes, I hope, in philosophy and theology, all right, this is why you have to do it. At a Catholic university, this is why you have to take courses in philosophy and theology, because both of these are valid and necessary ways of understanding our reality. They're mutually reinforcing on flight taken on two wings, as John Paul II described it. So in some ways, the question begins with a premise that I think Catholicism itself would reject, and which I think human reason itself would reject. if one was limited to human reason. That there is the possibility of knowing what human flourishing looks like, and human society can be ordered to that end. Now, it's true that we can decide to live as individuals in accordance with that end, but I think this is where Aquinas would want to correct us. He would want to advise us that human reason and human decision-making can be a weak reed. It can often be subject to a lot of temptations, as we know. What was the thing I had to learn in catechesis, Father? The near occasion of sin. Do we still say that? Avoid the near occasion of sin. In other words, the way that we prove that we're free is not by throwing ourselves in front of the near occasion of sin. It's rather to order the world so we're not constantly confronted with the near occasion of sin. It seems to me we've ordered the world so that we're constantly very near the occasion of sin. It's ordered so that we're constantly challenged by the near occasion of sin, of distraction, of all of the 7 deadly sins, every single one of them. Aquinas would want to argue that through law and culture, which work together, ideally, we order a society in which is not as difficult as it is for us to make the good decisions. And here I want to make an argument in a case that I made over on the other side of the river last night, that the common good especially has to be oriented toward common people, who are especially ill-equipped, it seems to me, especially in our day, to make the kinds of good decisions. And again, when I hear JT describe all of the good things that the modern world gives to us, I see a different reality, especially in those parts of the country, not far from here, maybe including here, that are struggling because the access to the common good has been made extremely difficult. Participation in the common good has been made increasingly only available, or more likely to be available, to people we describe as the elites, which is us, people who get to go to college, people who have grown up presumably often in families that give us the means and the tools to get into a college and succeed in life and get jobs in which we can have these kinds of choices. But what we see as a country, and if we talk about civil war, we see a country on the brink of what we sometimes describe as a new civil war, because we've divided the country into those who can benefit by making the individual choices without the guardrails and supports of the broader social order, both legal and cultural, those who are able to make those individual choices, and those without those guardrails are suffering mightily in our country today. So I think this concern about the common good with a special focus upon the common, the ordinary people, if they are not flourishing, then our society is definitively not good. We have deprived them of the goods of a common life and a common good. And unless we as a society commit to supporting the common good through philosophy, and yes, through revelation, then I fear we will be talking about some form of dissolution of civil war, whether it's a cold civil war, a hot civil war, skirmishes, and so forth. But every reading that I've ever undertaken in the history of political philosophy is that when this divide between the common people and the elites becomes wide enough and deep enough, the society will fail. It will cease to be a civilization.
I'm chomping at the bit to talk to you about that. I'm chomping at the bit to talk about that. I just told him I was chomping at the bit, a Kentucky thing, about chomping at the bit to talk about that, about this comment. I couldn't agree more that we have great inequities in our society. Although I may sound like super optimistic about our liberal institutions, I don't like the way they're being used. And I don't like the way that not enough of us are arguing that they should be used better. But our liberal institutions don't make decisions about who wins and loses. It's the people that use those institutions or work within those institutions that decide the outcome of decisions. We don't stand up, for instance, when gerrymandering takes place that favors one party over another. Why is that? That's not fair. That's not speaking to the common good. Having choice is freedom. Having no choice is no freedom. But we put up with gerrymandering when our team wins and the other team loses. That's not democracy as we perceive it in our liberal institutions. The tremendous inequities in wealth in our society. When people in Hollywood can pay several $100,000 and have their students, have their children accepted as students into high-priced institutions where they don't even play tennis and they get on the tennis team, that is our institution saying, no, this is not right. We have the ability to manage our liberal institutions, but we have to care enough about the common good to do it. Too often now we're not speaking across lines. Okay, good.
That's great.
Okay.
May I build on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I love this.
I just want you to be aware that even though I'm optimistic about our liberal institutions, I know we face tremendous challenges as a society.
Just to build on your point about...
Mike, a little higher.
Sure. Just to build on JT's point about caring about the common good, it strikes me that this has a direct relevance to the question of technology and the question of distraction. One of the reasons behind the Postman Pledge, as we're calling it, is that we're trying to cultivate in our own homes and in this little community of homes the habits of attention and presence. And I think if you're not capable of attending to actual people, and if you don't sense that you have some common stake, then there won't be a movement to use liberal institutions well. People won't care.
Right.
They won't have that habit of attention or presence.
Yeah, Supreme Court Justice Brandeis makes a great quote on this. He says, "The greatest menace to freedom is an inert people."
Sounds Tocquevillian.
One more minute.
One more question?
Yeah, one last one.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Do you see the Supreme Court jurisprudence of the past 60 years with regard to abortion, contraception, gender identity, and so forth as an outgrowth or fruition of liberalism, or is it an aberration of liberalism? If it's the former, is it accurate to say that the justices who brought about that jurisprudence are true liberals? Or is it more accurate to say they were illiberal?
I think maybe you spoke about this.
I'm astonished at the quality of these questions. You have a brain trust here. This is unbelievable. If I ever run for office, I want you in my cabinet. I think it's a direct outgrowth of liberalism, of, let's say, the mainstream of liberalism. Insofar as the animating anthropology is one in which the person is a chooser, right? And the will is privileged above all. The will and desire above all. It's the sovereign self at work in these decisions. And it's very interesting to look at the way this unfolds. You have Griswold in 1965, which articulates a right to privacy, but on the grounds that marriage is a uniquely privileged social institution, so it's protecting marriage. The Supreme Court did not affirm a right to contraception, and it still permitted the state to control and even ban the distribution of contraceptives. 1972, you have Eisenstadt decided, which now flips things, and I think you do see the unfolding of liberalism and its ultimate conclusions in terms of personal autonomy. You now have a right to contraception for unmarried people. And so now the state cannot ban the distribution of contraception, nor the use, okay? 1 year later, you have Roe. That is not accidental. And then, some 20 years later, you have Obergefell, or my math is terrible. However many years, 20, 25. And then you have Bostock. It all follows. because there's a conception of the human person at work which privileges choice. It's the Casey decision, the mystery of life passage. It's that conception of liberty, which is fundamentally incompatible with a Christian vision of the world, and frankly, with the nature of law, with the rule of law.
So, I actually want to speak to another part of this question that's unasked, which is, okay, let's say we have the conservatives on the court, which we know we are perhaps on the verge of a change to this jurisprudence. We'll see that in June, presumably, in the Dobbs decision. But let's look at the example of what conservative jurisprudence has looked like. So maybe it will be a change to some of this lineage of thinking. But conservative jurisprudence has also been profoundly liberal in another domain, which is in the economic domain. So we have two liberal parties that both act in their legal capacity as well as their juridical capacity, that advance a liberal understanding of the autonomous, free-choosing individual. And even as conservative jurisprudence pursues a more, let's say, traditional or Christian understanding, perhaps we'll see, although Bostock suggests otherwise, but perhaps. At the same time, it also defines our economic lives in exactly the terms in which it claims that we don't define our sexual lives. Individual, autonomous, free individuals. That any constraint upon our economic activities needs to be lifted in the name of individual liberty. And indeed defines, in some ways, the essence of our economic and political life in terms that are, it seems to me, reflect, again, this deeply liberal understanding of how we are as human beings. Corporations have more recognition as a person than an unborn human being. Corporations are persons. Speaking of campaigns, you have more protections if you are someone who spends money on a campaign than you do in just about any other form of speech, because what the Supreme Court has determined is that campaign money is speech. Campaign money is speech. And therefore there can be no limit or constraint on the amount of money that's given to campaigns.
Or requirements for where it came from.
Absolutely. And this jurisprudence has only continued. Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens versus United. So I think what we need to see is that there's a continuity, even where there's a division, seeming division between left and right in our politics today, the deeper and more consistent ethos, whether in our jurisprudence and our legal system, is in this liberal trajectory. And if we find discontents in the economic realm, if we're more inclined to find discontents in the sexual, social realm, those discontents are often come from the same source, but we're not connecting the deeper thread and the deeper story here. And I think until we begin to do that, in fact, this is where Catholic institutions actually have a big role to play, because I think we see this more clearly. We ought to see this more clearly, the deeper connection where these liberal anthropological metaphysical assumptions undergird both of our parties today and ask us to declare our loyalty to one of them with unsort of failing fealty. If that's our condition, then we should say, a pox on both your houses. And look and begin to articulate a very different understanding of the human person through both law, jurisprudence, and culture. So I think we need to see this as a kind of consistent ethos that problematically underlies the entire political, social, economic order. And on that happy note, we are perhaps concluded.
I would
Yes.
finalize my comments by sharing with you something that I've been touched by emotionally that Bertrand Russell says in an interview that he gave with the BBC in, I believe it was 1959. And he was asked what he would share with people, what lessons, 2 lessons he would share with people about how they should live their lives. And his first lesson was that we should learn to be skeptical about the truth. We should question from multiple perspectives what we're told is the truth. And the second thing he said was, if we should practice a tolerance that even if people say things, nasty things that we don't like, that we should be tolerant of that, because if we don't learn to love one another, we'll certainly all perish together. And I always found that most touching from Bertrand Russell, and you can pull that up on on the internet and listen to his presentation. I find it very soul satisfying. And so that's why I sound like an optimist, perhaps, with the idea that we have the ability to change the liberal forms and institutions that we work in. And I hope all of you share my optimism about the future of our greater community. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Deneen, Dr. Schindler, Dr. Spence for a rich, enlightening, and provocative discussion of many, many themes. And thank everyone for coming out to this evening's lecture. Have a good evening. It sounds as if it may have even stopped raining. So.
If I can